Welcome, future teachers. I am really looking forward to guiding you through lesson planning. And today we will begin with our introduction. But before we do, I want to say this. Many of you are like me. You got into education because you truly care about children and you want to take the opportunity to impact the lives of children. Some of you have had teachers that did that for you. They believed in you, they fortified your skills, and they helped you become more of yourself. As a teacher, you have an opportunity to introduce children to their own talents, gifts, and abilities. It is really a pleasure to be able to be that person for them. And as you have your students each year, you have that opportunity in your classroom to either go through the motions and do your job, or you can be a teacher who truly inspires, a passionate teacher that stirs something up in your students, who makes them excited about learning, who makes them want to get to school in the morning, and who gives them those skills that will not only help them as they continue school, but also strengthen them, knowing that someday they will be providing for themselves and for their family. They will be a citizen of our community who is hopefully taking an active role and becoming a leader in our community and a positive force. So, what a great opportunity we have as teachers. And when you are in the classroom, the way to make the most of your time with your students is to have an excellent lesson plan. Your plan is your strategy for giving your students the best experience of learning possible. So you can take that lesson plan like a rough draft and rewrite it and change things around and consider your students and think, oh, this is a group who really loves hands-on activities. Let me bring in these manipulatives for this lesson. Or this is a class that loves to act things out. Let me add that in. Or possibly you know a topic that really gets their attention, so you add that in as you're teaching a new concept. You have an opportunity. So I would like to challenge you, instead of just going through the motions as a student learning lesson planning, I want to challenge you to be a student who will exceed the highest expectations of yourself on how you do this. I'll never forget, I had a professor, Dr. Sagehorn, who was our department chair for years at Pitt State in the College of Ed. And I remember turning in lesson plans to her in our class, and she would say, just when you think you have your lesson plan completely finished, I want you to go back and add 3 new pieces that make your lesson plan even more impactful. I thought that was really a cool idea, to take an already great idea and how can we make it better? And so as an undergrad, I started thinking outside of the box and thinking about how to make these lessons especially meaningful. And I had great success. I can say that I had high test scores and happy students and happy parents. And that is not necessarily the order that I would say I value. What I value are the students who would go on to other grades, and others knew who had Mrs. Abbott because they remembered the information, they were excited about learning, they were lifelong learners. But even more than that, after 30 years of teaching, I can tell you I have adults coming to me, my grown former students, who are saying, Mrs. Abbott, you changed my life. And by helping me be my best, you challenged me, you motivated me. I never loved to read until your class. I never understood math until your class, or I struggled with these areas until your class. And now they're adults and they're successful and they are doing the best they can in their own lives, living their best lives. So what a great opportunity you have. So let's get into lesson planning. Let's fully understand it, embrace it, and make the best of lesson planning. So I'd like to begin with a question. How do you eat an elephant? Well, some of you have heard this one before, but according to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's from South Africa, and his answer is there is only one way to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. What I believe Desmond Tutu meant by this is in life, we're going to have those overwhelming challenges. And rather than looking at them in a negative way, let's just think and thinking, oh, that can't be done. I'm so overwhelmed. That's just too much. One step at a time, one piece at a time. Even something as simple, here's your practical application, as a puzzle, can seem so overwhelming until you say, okay, let's start with the border, or let's start by sorting the colors, and let's begin with the yellow section, and then the red section, and then the blue section. And all of a sudden, this 1,000-piece puzzle will eventually come together. So I'd like to invite you to take the challenges of your life and break them down. And that's exactly what we are going to do. All right, what you can expect from our videos. Number one, a general understanding. It's important for you to just have an idea of how all of this connects. I remember as an undergrad feeling like each one of my professors had a different way of doing lesson plans, and they each had something important to say, but they were different. And it made it a little bit confusing. I wished that I had more of a general understanding of the basics before I had all of the more complex options. So what I'd like to do for you is provide you with a general understanding. And with that, a practical application. So I mentioned that earlier. I love reading articles. Both Harvard Education and Stanford Education have some amazing articles. And one of the articles talked about the importance of using examples. Not only examples in education, they are extremely valuable, but also examples that have nothing to do with education, like the puzzle example. So you can count on practical application to go along with your understanding and your confidence in lesson planning. Also, I have an outline today of the key components that make up lesson planning. And what I will do is start large, and then we will break it down piece by piece in order for you to have a deeper knowledge of what makes a lesson plan great. We will have follow-up videos each time so you can continue to learn a little bit more and a little bit more as we dive a little deeper. And best practices in teaching, this is basically saying this is what the best of the best are doing. And it's research-based, and where research is supporting these practices, like, for example, using hands-on activities, is more likely to have students have deeper learning than if they are doing a worksheet, for example. So what we want to do is implement and use what success leaves clues. So we want to implement what the successful teachers have figured out and add that into our teaching. Those are our best practices, and I have a feeling you will do very well with them. So what is the point of a lesson plan? Well, a lesson can be kind of complicated if you're not sure your intention. So I want you to think about this. Usually you're teaching a new concept, but as we know, there are some concepts that need to be taught over and over before the students fully understand that lesson. We're not going to teach addition in one day and think, okay, they've got it. This is a skill that your students will need multiple practice with that same new concept before they're ready to go on to a broader area of that concept, which leads me to building on a concept. So we may have a brand new concept, but we also may be teaching to build on something we've already taught. So for example, teaching a new concept might be teaching your students similes or metaphors for the first time. Building on a concept would be if you are teaching, let's say, subtraction of single-digit numbers. That would be the new concept. Once your students have that down, then your next lesson, building on the concept, may include subtraction with double digits. And eventually you will have subtraction with borrowing. Then over time, your students will learn to subtract with integers and fractions and decimals. But again, it's a process. So we have to work that out, and we need to really prioritize what is the best idea to teach, best concept to teach first and next, and so on. But we will get into that as well. Sometimes we're teaching a lesson just to review concepts. Oftentimes, for example, if you're reading a book to a class, you might be reviewing the text structures, or you may be reviewing story elements. So, for example, the story element of main character or setting, conflict, resolution, plot. And as you're reading, you are asking the students questions about the different story elements. Maybe you are helping them have practice with making text to text, text to self, text to world connections, where they have a deeper understanding of what they're reading. So when you're doing anything with your students, such as reading a book, make sure you are always having some kind of an intention behind it of, okay, I need to highlight this simile that's in this book. We need to review this. Or let me ask a thought-provoking question that has a text-to-self connection so they can go a little deeper into the content of the text. But we don't just want to read the book and not ask any questions. We want to maximize that time. And finally, reteaching a concept. Sometimes we teach something and our students don't have it down. And the best thing you can do is just be really honest about that and think, okay, that lesson that did not work out, so let me try a different approach of teaching this concept. Then you reteach with that new attempt, and then you find out through your evaluation, through your assessment, how they did, and hopefully you will be able to move on. So these are the areas that you will be thinking about as you spend time teaching in your classroom. All right. Next, we have, why do we lesson plan? Well, lesson plans are awesome because they help align all of your learning goals. There was a time when I first started teaching where teachers could just teach anything they wanted to teach, and we really didn't have a guide. It was kind of fun in a way for some teachers because they got to do what they wanted to do, but it was a problem too. Part of that problem was we had several teachers teaching the same thing, and this would be something that didn't need to be repeated. So for example, we had several teachers dissecting owl pellets in their class. We had third grade teachers, fourth grade teachers, and fifth grade teachers doing this. Well, it's a fun lesson, and that's very much why they've decided to do that. But what we figured out is we really needed to align our curriculum, because while the students were getting this over and over and they had already had that concept down, there were some pieces that were missed because we weren't aligned. There were some fundamentals that were not being taught. And so we will go back through the alignment and we make sure, okay, just the third grade is going to do the dissection of the owl pellets now because it aligns with the standards. And okay, now we are going to need to include homonyms in each of the grades because this is part of our standards from the state, and each grade is responsible for not only teaching but also rehearsing the skill of using homonyms, for example. So alignment just helps us sort it all out, and also it helps keep our lessons developmentally appropriate. So for example, we're not going to teach the alphabet to fifth graders, and we're not going to teach the difference between a chemical and a physical change to a kindergartner. Well, maybe. There are a few kids who can handle that. But we really need to sort out the rigor and sort out the types of things that we're learning. Well, the government figured this out, and the Department of Education put out many different resources for teachers, and and also mandates that we follow a certain set of goals with our standards, and they really map out what we have. Also, with lesson planning, this is, like I said earlier, such a tool for you. It's a guide for you, a roadmap. As you're teaching a lesson, it's like your note sheet to make sure that you do all of those things that you want to make sure you do as you're teaching. So, for example, you might want to jot down the page numbers of the book where you're going to review with your students that simile, or bring out that part about the main character and some of the features that are listed. It's great to have that. It's also great to remind you of some of the different steps so you don't forget to make sure that you have each of your components until you can get it down. Now, I'll tell you, it's a lot like tying a shoe. Do you remember tying your shoe for the first time? Or if you have been around children who are tying their shoe, you can remember how they have their loop and then they're thinking about the other loop, and sometimes they pull too hard and they lose their loops, and they've learned to make their loops a little bit smaller. And through trial and error, they get to where they don't have to think loop and go around in another loop. They can just tie their shoe as they have the practice. This is the same thing for teachers. Right now, while you are in the College of Ed, you are going to have these lengthier lessons. But as you go on in your teaching career, they will not be quite so long. You will have a higher level of confidence when you teach, because when you have a great plan, you're going to be excited to teach what it is that you have prepared for your students. So as you put that time in, like I said earlier, what you put into your lesson plan, your students will benefit. I promise you, you will have higher success if you put more into that lesson plan. Also, what happens? Your students are learning. Your students are much more likely to understand the concept if you think it through ahead of time, if you really consider your students as you plan, and if you make great choices to maximize your time as you're teaching your lesson. And something else that's wonderful that goes along with this is strong classroom management. When you are prepared and you go in with a plan, you are likely to have students who are staying involved and staying engaged. And trust me when I say, if a student is bored, that is likely when you're going to have some misbehaviors. So it even helps with classroom management. And also, you want to consider classroom management as you are planning. So for example, each year I had a Native American project that I would work on with my students. And they worked in teams and they constructed these dioramas where they showed the setting of their given location. So maybe if they were the Plains Indians or the Eastern Woodland Indians, they created that atmosphere and showed all of the pieces that put together their environment and way of life. Well, this involved things like timber paints and mulch and dirt and different art supplies to put it all together. And instead of just allowing any of the 25 students to get up and get supplies, I strategically came up with a plan to only allow one student from each team. The team leader could get up and go back and forth for the art supplies. That kept the lessons going in a way that causes students to stay with their projects and continue to work rather than meandering around the room a lot, but also it kept the room nice and orderly and neat. So again, you can plan ahead with something as simple as having jobs for each of your kids and helping with the classroom management piece. Also, there is a variety of different lesson plans. As I said earlier, you are going to have lesson plans that are better suited for different areas of instruction, different content areas. But right now, as you are in the College of Ed, you are going to be introduced to formal lesson planning. These are lesson plans that are, like I said, more complex, a couple of pages long, where you're spelling out each detail. Back to the example of the child learning to tie their shoe. You are going to be thinking through each of these steps over and over and over until it becomes innate for you. So the formal lesson plans are something you'll be doing for your classes. Oftentimes, the formal lesson plans involve more steps than a mini lesson, which is coming up. For example, the formal lesson plans will have an evaluation, some kind of an assessment piece to make sure the students are learning. Mini lessons are a little bit different in the fact that they're just like the title suggests. They are small lessons. They oftentimes are used when a teacher notices that some students are struggling and they need to reteach. They may bring up the group of students, maybe 4 or 5 students around, let's say, a kidney-shaped table, and rehearse the skills together and work out the kinks wherever it is that the students are struggling, and doing a lesson right there with them, again, to make sure that they fully understand. Perhaps this mini lesson would be a way to teach it maybe with a different angle than before. Mini lessons can be used for a full class if there is a quick skill the teacher needs to introduce before getting into the other activities. So mini lessons are great. Something to be aware of is curriculum mapping. This is something else that school districts have started implementing to help with the alignment of the curriculum. This is basically where districts have taken the guesswork out of what you need to be teaching. Oftentimes it's guided by the state standards, and they map out what is to be taught in each grade level, just as I mentioned earlier. And it is also helpful if the teachers can provide information of how their students are doing in each of the different areas for which they're responsible. And it's great because it causes the teachers who will be getting the students from the year before to look back and say, oh, it looks like they struggled a bit with this area. I'm going to spend some extra time in this area. And it's a great way to collaborate, to communicate, and to have a nice broad plan of what each teacher is responsible for teaching. And to go even deeper with that are pacing guides. Many schools have instructional coaches, and those are people who work with curriculum and who will put out the curriculum mapping and help teachers with their lesson planning and providing resources and manipulatives and that type of thing. But also, oftentimes they will have a pacing guide. A pacing guide can be very specific. They go from the curriculum map to what the teacher is responsible for, and they will even take those standards and break them down month by month, week by week, day by day, sometimes even minute by minute, depending on the district. This can be really great if you are someone who feels a little bit unsure of what to do. They're giving you the absolute map and guide exactly what to do. Some teachers who are a little bit more creative have a hard time with the pacing guide because they might want to spend a little bit longer on something if they think that their students need a little bit more time with the concept, or they may want to add something in that's different than what the other teachers are doing. Also, it makes it difficult sometimes to teach across the curriculum where you teach across the different departmental levels. So for example, if you want to have social studies and writing paired together, I know with the Native American projects that I mentioned earlier, I had my students create a report showcasing the way of life and the environment and how the environment was used with each different Native American group. Once the paper was complete, they could construct the diorama. But we had our ELA, which was our reading, and then we had our writing of the report, and then they presented their reports and their dioramas, and they had the presentation, the speaking and listening skills, along with social studies. So it was a great way to incorporate all of it. So hopefully you will be in a district that if there is a pacing guide, you will have the freedom to teach across the disciplines, across the content areas. And finally, the good news for most of you is lesson plan books. When you get into your classroom, most likely you will not have to complete the 2 to 3 page formal lesson plan for your principal, but a lesson plan book would be sufficient. Oftentimes, that's where you will state your goal, your objective, and give just a brief idea of what you are needing, maybe a page number or maybe a manipulative, whatever it is that your goal is. and how you're going to get to that goal in the assessment you're going to use to make sure your students are learning. So the plan book, if you remember those plan books, a lot of teachers had that, like a 3-ring binder or some kind of a spiral bound book that had the little boxes. That's what most teachers use. There are many online resources now and really great complete books. I've had so many first-year teachers show me their lesson plan books that they're using because they are very well thought out and structured now, and they are really enjoying them. So I think you will too. When it comes to lesson planning, when we get right to it, there is a checklist, and I have provided this for you on our modules. But these are the main areas that you will see in each lesson plan, despite the content area. So whether it's a social studies, a science, a math, an ELA lesson, these are areas that need to be addressed. One, you'll begin by determining the grade level in the content area. So, okay, this is going to be a 4th grade lesson and we are working on social studies. Then you're going to align to the college and career readiness standards. So perhaps you have that pacing guide or that curriculum map from your district, but if not, you will need to go to KSDE and find your state standards. My advice is, if you're a 4th grade teacher, print off all the standards for your grade level, hole punch them, put them in a binder, and just have them so you don't constantly have to go back and forth to the website to find your standards. Just have them there. And you will align, meaning you will put your requirements down. Lesson planning, again, can be pretty overwhelming, so I will say more soon about how you can take all of those standards and put them into a year. All right, let's go on. In that lesson plan, you will need to have a performance objective and an evaluation. So you're thinking, what do I want my students to be able to do, some kind of an action, by the end of this lesson? So you're beginning with the end in mind. It's also referred to as backwards mapping. So you're thinking, okay, I would like my students to fully construct a Native American environment showcasing the way of life, the homes, and the different resources from the environment that were used. And I will know that they did this by, and that's the next part, the evaluation. That is the part where we have some way to determine, did they learn or not? So you've got to have something. So for me, I used a rubric to make sure that the students met the goals that I had set for them. Again, there'll be more on this. The materials, that's the easy part, but what are every piece of material that will help your lesson become a success for your students? From the books to the manipulatives to any resource possible. Maybe you're using the internet. Whatever it is, this is where you list that. The anticipatory set is so much fun. This is where you are grabbing your students' attention and getting them ready for learning by using an anticipatory set. They're anticipating what they're about to learn. Oftentimes, teachers can get really creative here and do something like maybe wearing some kind of a hat that goes along with their lesson, or having some kind of a poem that they read that goes along with the lesson, or perhaps they ask a question that's riveting. It makes the students really start thinking, and it leads to the lesson. The next part is the lesson introduction. This is where the teacher just states to the students what they will be learning. Then the long part is the teacher instruction. This is where the teacher goes in and explains the concept, gives multiple examples of practical application to explain the concept, then checking for understanding, making sure that the students are understanding what was just taught. So it's important for the teacher to do it, to model it, and then check for the understanding by working together with the class and doing some of that activity together. So for example, with teacher instruction, we may have the teacher, for example, read a sentence for, let me think of when I worked with having the students use adjectives to enhance their writing. Maybe we had a basic sentence like the dog walked down the road. Well, that would be pretty boring. So I would teach the students about adjectives, what they mean, how they work, where we put them, some of the rules that go along with them. And then I would take a boring sentence like the dog walked down the road and add the adjectives. So let's describe the dog. The small, fluffy Maltese strutted down the leaf-covered road. So I would go through and give that example and teach the students how to insert adjectives to make the sentence more specific and come alive using adjectives. Then it would be time for the students to do that with me. And as they did that, that would be my check for understanding. I would take a sentence, I would call on students, and together as a class, we would work on that together. And if they weren't getting it, I would go back and reteach a little bit more. But if they were getting it, then I would say, okay, they seem to have this. Now they're going to do it on their own. I'm going to give them an activity with some different sentences that they can now make more meaningful, more exciting using adjectives. And once they did that, that would be their guided practice application. And I would then have some kind of a measurement. So I may say, I need 3 adjectives added per sentence. That would be my measurement. That's how I'd make sure that they were learning. And then once that was complete, I would close out my lesson by saying one last time what we just learned and giving them a reminder of what that is, and then reminding them where they can use this lesson again in the future. So don't worry, there's a lot more to go with lesson planning, but this is the nutshell, and we will just keep going from here. I hope this has been informative, and I look forward to seeing you again in a future video.